Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Political Excess. I don't often do a lot of political commentary on this channel. I generally like to cover elections neutrally. I don't like to be a partisan cheerleader, but of course I do have certain views on specific issues. For this commentary, there's not going to be any video. It's going to be more like a podcast with only audio. So feel free to play this in the background while you do whatever you want to do. But anyway, I want to point out what I think sucks about both political parties. I understand a lot of people might just say both parties are similar. They're controlled by corporations and billionaires, and they're just designed to have us all fighting amongst ourselves while the elites at the top control everything. I think there's some truth to that, of course, but I think that's a little bit overly simplistic, and there are plenty of specific issues within each party that you could discuss, but I'm going to focus on two macro issues that I think are causing voters to run away from both of these parties. And remember, there's going to be a lot more I could say about these issues, but I'm just going to try to keep it relatively short. So first I'm going to start with the Republicans. So if you want to hear me bash on the Democrats, skip ahead to that part of the video. So with the Republicans, why do I think that they fail? And what causes voters to run away from them? I think it's largely economics. That's a broad concept, but by and large, an economic populist message is popular. That could include a whole range of topics: collective bargaining, minimum wage, paid family leave. Those types of issues, whenever they're put to a vote, the people want that stuff. Now, I think it's fair to point out that sometimes in exchange for having those things, there are other negative consequences down the road, and I think those issues should be fleshed out. But even having said all that, I think having a minimum baseline of economic safety net, just enough to make your quality of life be acceptable, those are winning issues, and those are not with the Republican Party. But the biggest economic-related issue of all, I think, is with healthcare. I definitely think getting the costs down is a real concern. I do think there's a lot of greed in the healthcare industry, and that does need to be addressed. There's a point where profits get out of hand, and all the bureaucracy in between has become such an extreme turnoff for the vast majority of Americans. So guaranteeing all Americans the right to some sort of basic health care, that's a winning issue, and that's never going to change. And in the richest country and the greatest country in the world, I can understand why it does seem pretty outrageous that so many people do lack health care. Of course, funding is a concern. Of course, overloading the system is a concern. We don't want the quality of the health care to be subpar. But to still not have some sort of baseline that's above emergency room care, I think that's unacceptable. So maybe you draw the line at only American citizens. Maybe you have to institute a payroll tax to cover this. Maybe you do need a progressive income tax where people with millions of dollars are paying a little bit more. That's all going to seem perfectly reasonable to the working class. But the Republican messaging on health care, I don't think it's great at all. The only thing I've seen them really move on in the last couple of election cycles is they say they're not going to take away protections for pre-existing conditions. But that is extremely low-hanging fruit. I so rarely hear any of them talking about expanding coverage and getting more people the care they need. There has to be some sort of public option for people that are unable to afford it, because healthcare is something everybody is going to need. It's going to come up at a time you least expect it. And the costs are astronomical, and people cannot afford that. Even in a lot of reasonable paying jobs, it's going to be too expensive. And similarly with Medicare, that definitely should cover dental and hearing and vision. And it should be able to cover it without cutting into other people's Social Security benefits. Now, I don't think the Democrats are really all that much better on health care. When they're out of power, they talk a big game, and then when they get in power, they deliver so minimally on health care. To me, that was one of the biggest disappointments of the Biden administration so far. Prior to getting in, all I heard about was health care, and then it just seemed to go onto the back burner. And then the big thing we're supposed to celebrate is Medicare negotiating prescription drug prices. I think a lot of people think that's crumbs, and I don't blame them. But health care and economics is, I think, the biggest reason that people don't go more into the Republican Party. I think Republicans should be more vocal about how there is a point where the economic inequality is actually a problem. Most people tend to be against the ultra-rich. We know they control inordinate amounts of power on the economy and society at large. And if Republicans embrace that kind of a message just a little bit more and then actually deliver on some of the goods, I personally think that would go a long way. Now, the Democrats are stronger on that type of populist economic messaging. There's just no doubt about it. But this brings me into where the Democrats have completely went wrong and why people leave the Democratic Party. And the main problem with them is cultural. A little bit of social, but it's mostly cultural. And I could even use an example about economics as to where they went wrong. Earlier last decade, there was a ton of the Occupy Wall Street, We Are the 99% movement, and there's certainly going to be some criticisms you can have with that movement. However, that messaging, most people generally agree with that sentiment. So if most people agree with that, why do I not hear about it anymore? Well, this is where the Democrats completely derailed. They seemingly took everything away from individual economics, and they centered everything around group identity politics. And nearly all of it became structured around race, sex, and sexual identity. And all that really did was separate everybody further. And since that time, the concepts of social justice or wokeness, that has become pervasive in society. Hollywood, academia, and corporate America, they by and large mostly adopted the principles of that movement. And I think that movement has really done itself a disservice by making your group identity essential to who you are and where you're supposed to be on a given issue. They became obsessed with group power dynamics centered around race and sex and sexual identity. Even other categories such as disability status, religion, all of those categorizations have resulted in a quest for more victimhood, as it's undeniable that there is a lot of power in being a victim. We've seen more people associated on the left with gaining a lot through being a victim that we've started to see in the last couple of years, more people on the right trying to become a victim because apparently it works. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. But culturally, the Democratic Party is much more associated with focusing on all of America's flaws. And I would argue it's to an excess. And the discussion of those flaws has dominated society and the discourse to the point where people that have dissenting views are much more inhibited and intimidated to speak up. Rapid changes on language and gender and sexuality, they've seemingly pressed full speed ahead with very little tolerance for questions or pushback. There's really become so much fear around questioning the purported social justice movement, and most of that fear is centered around being labeled one of the usual isms, and I think that is a serious problem, because when the fringes are not called out, and when those fringes have such a loud voice, then a larger portion of society lives in silence, harboring alternative views. And to see a rapid societal change over the past 5 to 10 years, that can be unnerving for many people. So many things over the past several years have been labeled unacceptable, racist, sexist. We go through history trying to find some reason people would be unacceptable today, and while we have to tarnish their legacy, there's countless examples of names that have been changed, people that have lost jobs, and an overall sense of hyper-scrutiny on the expression of any sort of views that don't line up with the extreme social justice movement. I think the Republican Party was more associated with this problem back in the 90s. Christian conservatives opposing anything and everything related to gays, those views were not broadly popular. But now we've moved largely beyond that, and now we've gotten to the point where if you don't want to celebrate that lifestyle, you're going to be looked down upon. We've gotten to the point where you can seemingly change your gender at will, where incorrect gender pronouns have been considered violence, where you can openly celebrate any kind of identity as long as you're not straight or white or a male, where inclusivity is defined by who we're going to exclude, where diversity has become a catch-all buzzword only to hyper-focus on people's identities, where words like equity have become tantamount to equal outcomes, but it's not supposed to matter, as it's just evening out the group benefits. To me, it really does seem like these people really want everyone to be equally poor instead of lifting up anyone that's in a dire economic situation. And that's where I think they completely lost me. Every time we talk about economics now, all I hear is predominantly affecting black and brown communities. To me, there's nothing that's going to separate us more by making sure we emphasize a couple of different races instead of including everyone in that situation. So I do think there are legitimate concerns about this kind of a movement, and it is 100% associated with the Democratic Party. They really have switched places culturally with where the Republicans were 30 or 40 years ago. The purportedly most inclusive and tolerant people became the most virulently intolerant, telling you what words you're allowed to say purely based on your identity, telling you what costume you're allowed to wear on Halloween, telling you how much weight your opinion matters based on your color. It all amounts to having a different set of rules based on your immutable characteristics. They would have a far better winning argument advocating for something like universal basic income, where everybody gets a certain amount of money, and we're not going to judge people based on their race. We're not going to come out with a COVID vaccine and then worry about if people over 65 get the vaccine first, that too many of them will be one color. To me, that line of thinking is hypocritical, illogical, and detestable. We often hear about the fringes of the right and their identity politics. My view on that is that fringe, it's much, much less of a thing than the media makes it out to be, and those views are already castigated in society. Those people are pariahs. But the fringes on the left, and those that advocate identity politics openly and unabashedly, those views are not excoriated. There's a whole industry centered around advocating for it. It's gone from the universities down to some of the schools. It's in HR departments. It's all over the place. And while there is more and more of a little bit of a backlash, by and large, those views are either tolerated or celebrated. And that, to me, is where the problem really is. The media can always paint any narrative it likes, and it can hype up the fringes on the right over and over and over, and it will freak people out. But the reluctance to highlight the fringes on the left, and I think there are many, that I think is a serious problem worth discussing, and I think a lot of people are aware of it, but it hasn't changed much. So that is what I think is wrong with both of these two major political parties. If the Republicans opened up to addressing some of these economic concerns of the working class and were actually serious about giving Americans health care, that would be a solid win for them. Sure, some of their other issues are not going to be extremely popular. Banning all abortions, overturning the 2020 election, those are a couple of issues, but there's other ones. And those are also not going to help the Republican Party. But economics, that's the direction they really need to move in. And the Democrats, they need to stop structuring any economic message centered around your identity. That is a complete loser. We don't want every single government program to have lines of text in it that constantly references historically marginalized groups. We want to be treated like individuals based on our individual circumstance and not how society has historically viewed different groups. We don't want to be told who can say what, and we don't want to have an extreme punishment for something innocuous we said in our private lives 10 or 20 years ago. We want actual tolerance and not an overabundance of tolerance only for people that you think are on the bottom of the power totem pole. So to me, that's why I think both of these parties lose voters. They both have strengths, they both have weaknesses, and there's plenty of other issues that I didn't even discuss in here. Immigration, crime, foreign policy, pollution, other types of tax code. Those are all relevant points. But for this video, I just wanted to touch on where I think both of these parties are going wrong. There's of course plenty more you could say about it, but I wanted to just take a step back, away from the unbiased election coverage, and mention some of my more specific personal views. I try to keep it broad enough, because I do have a variety of different views on different specific issues. But generally speaking, I think I laid it out there pretty well. You don't have to agree with me on all of it. I do tend to tolerate a lot of different types of views, and I always encourage an open dialogue. So let me know in the comments. Do you generally agree with what I see as the problem with both of these political parties? And do you like these types of political commentaries? Or do you disagree, think I got it all wrong, and the Republicans are great on economics, and the Democrats are great on the cultural issues? Let me know down below. And if you enjoy this channel, Please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.